right, so I'm Alexis. Hello. I'm a front-end developer. I am also a teacher with Maracana. I actually have a boot camp coming up April 16th in New York City. If any of you are from the East Coast, that's where I'm from. But I'll also be back in San Francisco, I think sometime in June for Maracana again. I wrote a couple books. I co-wrote the first one with the Orange Robot with Estelle Whale and Louis Lazarus, which has done really well and was a really awesome book to work on. And then more recently, this other one, Learning CSS Animations and Transitions. And I'm super excited that I can say that both of my books have robots on the cover. I think that's a really big achievement. And sometimes I kind of have like two lives. I used to work on Wall Street, and now I'm really into financial reform, so I actually occasionally pop up on the Rachel Maddow show sometimes. So if you ever turn on MSNBC and see someone that kind of looks like me, it probably is me. But that's neither here nor there. And just one other warning about me, I might talk about cats at some point in this presentation. So if you hate cats, I apologize. Okay. So that's me. I want to know a little bit about you guys before I start. So who's used CSS transitions already? Okay, pretty much all of you. Sweet. And then who's used CSS animations, keyframe animations? Okay, about half. Okay, and this is the most important question, so I want you to pay attention. Who has visited the pirate store in the Mission? Okay, good. So see these people, talk to them, or find the pirate store. I believe it's 826 Valencia. You can get an eye patch. And true story, my friend Ingrid, who's from San Francisco, said that I should buy an eye patch, wear it for the duration of the talk, and not acknowledge that I was wearing an eye patch. And as you can see, I failed to do that, but maybe next time. So I'm really into words, so before we get started, I just want to kind of like define what we're talking about. So when we talk about animation, we go back like to the etymology of the word. It's actually kind of about spirit and life and breathing life into things. And so really what I want to talk about today is not anything crazy complicated, not any kind of multiple chained flash style animation, but just actually a couple of really simple examples that you can add. Whoa, sorry, that was inevitable. Simple things that you can do to sites that you already have, just to kind of add a little bit of like pep and pizzazz and a little bit of like life and movement. So that's the goal. Now, the reason I think that animations are important and worth taking the time to add even to a site that works fine without them, probably most of all is because it can provide important feedback to the user. So it can give them this sense that, oh, this action that I took was responded to, was received by the website, and it can be used in that way, and I think that that's really important and really helpful. The other thing is just more fun, right? It can make it more immersive, it can make it more entertaining and interesting, and more like a real rich experience. And then I guess the last reason is just, there's really, in my mind, no excuse not to animate a handful of things on your sites, because chances are your site has an image on it somewhere. And in sites that are not going to support sites, in browsers that are not going to support these animations, if you animate an image or add some kind of transform, that image is still going to show up, right? You just won't see the animation. So it's a really good idea, in my mind, to just add a little bit of extra flair to things that are going to show up regardless. But then for all of us who are using modern browsers, we get to see a nice little interesting, rotation or something like that. So it seems like most of you know this already, but just to like make sure that everybody's on the same page, I'm just going to go through this a bit quickly, just like the basics about how this works. So there's two kinds of animations that you can set in CSS3. There's transitions and keyframes, or CSS animations. I'll use those two terms interchangeably. Transitions are great because they're fast, because the browser is actually saying, okay, you had a property that was green, you changed it to blue, and I'm going to interpolate the difference between green and blue. And the browser is really fast at doing that. And just in case you don't know that word interpolate, it just means when there's 2 points, it's figuring out how to get from one point to another. And if there's multiple points, it's some computer figuring out how to get from A to B to C to D to E. So it's fast, but there's no built-in way to repeat it. So if you want to do some nice little thing on a loop, a transition's not the best. It's also not great if you want to do anything more complicated than this sort of like on-off A to B, green to blue, 200 to 100, big to small. So keyframes are going to be a little bit slower because you're taking over the responsibility from the browser of doing that. Not all of the interpolation, because you're still going to define some significant intermediate points, but the browser's not doing everything, and so it's going to be a little bit slower. But it's much more flexible, and there's a lot more options. So it's the like 360, not 360, bird's eye. Again, most of you probably know this, but just in case, the two things that you must use if you're going to use a transition are these two properties. What is the property you're trying to transition, and what is the duration of that transition? And here's an example of what that would look like. There's some additional ones that you can use, transition timing function and transition delay. Just quickly, this is what the different transition timing functions look like. So the default is called ease. There's linear, there's ease in, which is a little bit slower at the beginning. Ease out is a little bit slower at the end. And then you can define your own, which is what this cubic Bezier one is. And so who's seen this tool before? Some of you. This is awesome. So this is Leah Verreau, whose name I don't know how to pronounce her last name, but I'm such a fangirl of her. She's amazing. So this is a way to create your own custom timing function. And a timing function is just the rate at which the animation plays. And so once I've created my own custom function here, I can click go, and it will compare my custom function to the default, which is ease. Or I can compare it to linear and see how it plays. And one thing that I mentioned on this slide that you might have seen, this was from a couple years ago, that she put together a really good talk, 10 secrets you may not know about CSS, and she just followed it up in February with 10 more secrets, both worth watching. Both are linked on the slides, where she mentions that you can make a bounce kind of an animation happen if you extend the cubic Bezier beyond the 0 to 1 values. And so if you watch this little, I guess that's pink, you see how it goes past the end and then it sort of bounces back. If you make a Bezier curve like this, you can get that little sort of pop back. And that's one of the things that she covers in this talk, which is worth watching if you haven't seen it already. So this is just an example of using the shorthand. So we can combine all of these properties together into the shorthand transition. You don't need to specify them all, but if you wanted to specify them all, it would look something like this. So let's say when a change happens to background color, we want that change to happen over the course of 2 seconds. We want the timing function and the rate at which that animation plays to follow this ease pattern, which is this blue one. And we want to delay it by a second before it begins. So transitions are really about setting up an animation that's going to fire as soon as a change happens to the property you want to pay attention to the transition of. And you can specify multiple transitions on a single element. Oops. Oh, this is code, not a text area. So if I just had a second one just like this, after this I could have a comma, and then I could have a second transition. So if I want to set up a different transition for color with a different duration than I want for background color, I can do that. I just need to run through the whole list of properties, and then comma, and then start over again. So let's get practical. I always try to look around at sites who are using animations in a way that's clever. And when I say clever, I don't actually mean complicated. I mean simple, but like helpful. So Delta has this search box that when you focus on it, expands. Nothing really complicated happening here, but I really like that because I'm really used to kind of not knowing whether or not I have focus on a given input field. And I think that this is a really simple thing that makes it really clear where your focus is, and it's really quite easy to accomplish. And so I really liked it when I noticed it. They're doing some other things here, like this expands when you load the page, which is another little transition that they have, or I guess when you highlight. But this is quite easy to replicate. So I just have it here on this slide, so you can see when I focus, it expands, and that's really about it. And so the way this works, you can probably guess how it works. So the input field has a class, search field. I set up a transition. Okay, when the width changes, let's change the width over 0.8 seconds. Cool. Our starting width is 10 ems, which looks like this. And then on focus, we change the width to 15 ems, and it just expands. If you want it, so right now it's extending out. I always get confused when I'm doing a presentation, if that's my left or my right. It's expanding out that way. If you want it to expand out the other way, you basically just have to change the text alignment, and it will expand out the other direction. And if you align it in the middle, then it will expand out evenly in both directions. So you can use the text alignment to dictate how you want the box to expand. So that's just a simple example of how you might use a transition to give your user some feedback about their action and where their focus is on. This is another example that I saw on the web, little inspiration. I didn't even know about this site. This is great. So if you want to buy something for yourself and you have no money and you want to ask your friends to buy it for you, shareagift.com. So pay attention to this little triangle. So they're using some jQuery to detect where I'm scrolling, and as I scroll down to different sections, it just moves the little navigation pointer around. And I just thought that looked kind of neat. And you can go fast or slow, but all this is a bit of jQuery to detect the scrolling and where the scroll is. So I think it's using like offset and top in jQuery. But the animation is just a transition. So I have another little example to replicate this. It's much more simple than that. It's not using scrolling at all. Let me just show it to you before I talk about the code. So basically the way this works, well, let me just show you how it works. So you click on the individual ones, and it just moves the triangle around. So I just have a little bit of jQuery. So I am basically watching for the click event on these 3 ID selectors, which are just these LI elements that make up, it looks messed up when I'm all smushed, but that make up my navigation. So that's this line. I add in a class that is set to the ID of the element I've clicked. So if I've clicked about, it adds the class about to the triangle. And the triangle is this div that's just that little triangle. Do people know how to make that triangle with the borders? Most people. So if you've never done this before, it's kind of fun the first time you do it. This triangle is just a div with like a height and a height of 1 and a width of 0, with a left border and a right border set to transparent, and a bottom border set to green. And the bottom border is 15 pixels, so then you get a transparent border, green, and it creates that bevel, and you get the triangle. So it's just a border. So I'm adding this class about blog or home to my little div, depending on what I've clicked. And then the transition, which is why we're all here, is, again, quite simple. I'm just paying attention to changes to margin left, and any change to margin left should happen over 1 second. And so here I just sort of have, it's kind of just like a CSS switch statement almost. If the class is set to home, the margin is 4.2. If it's about, it's 10.2. And if it's blog, it's 16.2. And that just gets me the result I showed you before, which is just this little guy moving around as I click. So again, nothing too fancy, but I thought it was a neat effect. And it's pretty easy to add. This is really just a repeat. Okay, this is my favorite one. This is another one from Leah, from her talk in February. So let me just show this to you first. So do people know what a light box is? I assume people know what that, yeah. So with a light box, you typically have something that either spreads out wide and then goes tall, or goes tall and then spreads out wide, and you get an effect kind of like that. And it's usually accomplished by JavaScript, and then you sort of reverse it when you close the overlay. And so in Leah's talk, she basically described how to do this with just CSS, basically. And so the way this works is there's 2 transitions set up. There's basically 2 elements. In this case, I'm doing it on the hover action. So in this case, by default, I am going to transition width over the course of 1 second and height also over 1 second, but with a delay of 1 second. So that means that the width is going to go first. The height is not going to change at all. And then once the width is done, then the height will change. So that's how I get the sort of opening and then the growing like that. So that's sort of on the way in. I guess that's on the way out, sorry. The way in is on the hover. And so on the way in, it's just the opposite. The height goes first, and then the width waits for a second, and then the width goes. So they're just multiple transitions, one on 2 different elements, basically. And you can just see that they're just slightly reversed. We could do them the same if we wanted to have the same behavior both ways, but I think it looks a little bit better to do it different. See, I'm not a huge fan of it sort of smushing up like that and then going. And this is used on the W3Conf homepage, and it's also used on webplatform.org. So if you click on any video on the webplatform.org, you get this effect, and it's all powered by CSS transitions. And I do not want to play this video right now. And then when I click this, it shrinks back down. And so obviously there's a little bit of jQuery or JavaScript sort of triggering that, but the animation is all done with really those two simple lines, here and here. So I really like this effect a lot. Yay. Kittens. Okay, talked about that. Okay, so that's my picture of a kitten in a glass of beer for you. There's no explanation other than that. Okay, so this is shifting gears. So transitions are cool. They're also quite simple. There's only so much you can do, and you can't loop them. You also can't do more than A to B. So if you wanted to do something like this little bouncing spring, you're kind of out of luck, because this bouncing spring it expands, and then it goes, contracts, and then expands a little less, and then it contracts, and then it expands even a little less. And so you can't do that with a transition, because you're just going from A to B. So if we want to do something like this, we need a keyframe animation. So again, I'm just going to assume that you're rusty. I'm sure you're not, but might as well. Refresh. So the way we set up a keyframe is a 2-step process. First, we set up what are called the keyframes. And these are kind of like, if you think about like Walt Disney cartoons and how they used to have the individual cells, these are kind of like that, except we get to skip a bunch of the frames. We just get to define the ones that are really important, and then the browser figures out the rest. So in the simplest case, you either have a 0% to 100%, or the keyword from and to. And so this is basically your starting point and where you want to go. And so this sets up your frames, but it will not play the animation until we call the animation property. And then this is just a shorthand. This is that. This is how long we want it to take. This is how much we want it to repeat. And infinite will repeat it infinitely. And then here's our timing function. So who remembers the 80s? I didn't manage to put the audio tag on this, but one day I will. So this is basically that, right? So what am I doing here? I'm saying rotate Y, begin at 0 degrees, turn all the way around to 360, and then do it infinitely and do it over 18 seconds. This is basically the output of the previous slide, plus a little bit of extra stuff. There is just a couple things I should mention about this, since this is a 3D transform. And I know this is not a 3D transform talk, but just briefly. So regular rotate or rotate Z is like rotating like that. Rotate Y is like, if this is my Y-axis, we're rotating about the Y. And rotate X, if here's my X, we rotate about my X. There's a problem with using these without a magical property. And shout it out if you know it. What is the property I need to set before I do 3D transforms?
Scale.
I don't think I heard it. It's perspective. And the way I think about this is kind of like when I go to the museum, by default, this property called perspective is 0. Perspective 0 is like going to the museum and putting your nose right up on the canvas, or really close to the canvas. And it's kind of cool because you can see the like texture of the paint, but you cannot see the composition. When you're at the museum and you want to see the composition, you have to take this like metaphorical step back from the painting, and then you can see the whole composition. Perspective is kind of like that. By default, when we do a 3D transform and perspective is set to the default, which is 0, it's just going to look smushed. It's not going to look 3D. So we need to set perspective to something like 500 or 800 seems to be the sweet spot, and then we'll be able to actually see the 3D transform. I can show you this just really quickly in this code. I just wanted to mention that, though. So here it is. Just WebKit perspective 800. And that has to be on the containing div for some reason. Yeah, question or comment? There's something called Preserve 2D, or sorry, Preserve 3D. But I do have that set. You mean the point at which it kind of turns and it's 180 degrees? Not that I know of, because that's kind of, I guess, what I would expect to happen. What would you want to happen? Oh, the very edge? Yeah, that would be cool. I suppose that if you built it in 3 dimensions, this is just like a flat pane with no, I guess, depth. I suppose if you added a depth, that you could do that and achieve it. I just haven't tried it myself. But that's a good question. That would be fun to try. Okay, let me go back. Because we're talking about keyframes. Okay, so again, just review. There's a bunch of properties you can set. 2 that are not present in transitions that you should know about. Well, 3. Iteration count, how many times you want it to loop. 1, 10, 5, infinite. Animation direction, which is, let's see, I'm like looking for a prop. If I'm making this thing like go like that, and I don't set animation direction to reverse, it's gonna go here and then jump, and here and then jump. If I set animation direction to reverse and I've set my iteration count to 2 or more, it's gonna go like that, as opposed to going here and then jumping back to where it was. So reverse just lets you go back and forth. And then fill mode is really important, and so I have just a little slide about it. So this has to do with whether or not the styles that you apply to your keyframe stick around after your keyframe is over. So just by way of example, so these both have the same animation, but do you see how one of them stays purple and the other one flips back to light blue, which was the original color? I just want to do it one more time. So the top one flips back, the bottom one stays purple. The bottom one stays purple because it has animation fill mode set to forwards, which basically means whatever your final keyframe was, apply it even after the keyframe has finished playing. By default, animation fill mode is set to none, which just means whatever style you had in keyframe 100%, I don't care about. I'm going back to the way the element originally was. So there's forwards, which is the one I use the most. There's backwards, which is basically whatever is in keyframe 0 will stick. And that makes sense if you're alternating and you end on a, let's see, 1, 2, even number. So if I wanted to alternate twice, that would mean I was ending on the 0% keyframe. If I want that to stick around, I should say backwards. And if for some reason I want the 0% keyframe to apply before I begin animating, and I want the 100% keyframe to apply after I'm done animating, I can use this value both. Okay. So who's used this library? Some of you. This is great. This guy that made this is awesome. So this is just a bunch of keyframes for you to use, just a bunch of templates. So you can customize it and choose which effects you want. You can get all of them, or you can do what I like to do, which is just check it out on GitHub and see how he did it. So I really just like to kind of look at his keyframes and see what's going on. So like you can see this bounce one. So I should mention what's happening here. I mean, you can probably guess, right? This is just like grouping selectors regularly is in CSS. we want the 0% keyframe and the 20% and the 50% keyframe to all get the translate Y of 0, which is handy because you don't want to have to list these all out manually. So this is a very handy tool, especially as you're getting started and want to kind of figure out different effects that you might want to apply to your buttons. Fade up and out. It's all kinds of good stuff. Bouncing down. So there's just one thing I want to make sure I mention, and I'm not sure if I have a slide about it. Oh, I do. I have a slide about it later. Okay, so this is just a silly example. I didn't wear my eye patch, so I thought I would make a weird pirate thing. I don't know. I found this on Open Clip Art. I think it's supposed to be an alien. Oop, where did my alien? Oh, there he is. So the way this works is you have this eye. It's a little bit creepy. It has a keyframe animation set up. It takes 2 seconds. It's infinite, and it alternates, which is why the eye kind of goes around and then back and around and then back. And I know it's not very natural, but this is like an alien pirate, so I don't know what you want. So here's the rotation. It's just from 0 degrees to 360. The only thing that's tricky about this is getting the transform origin right. So the 50% was pretty easy. The 30 pixels I had to think about. So let me just slow this down for 1 second. So basically, I wanted to rotate this about here. And so the width of this eye it's 20 pixels wide, I think. But it has a 10 pixel border, so it's basically like 40 pixels by 40 pixels. And so I set the transform origin to be 30, which is about here. And so that's the anchor point by which this thing rotates around. So I don't think it's totally perfect, and I could probably tweak it a little bit better. But it pretty much stays within the confines of the socket, eye socket. So that's really the only tricky part about doing something like this, is getting that transform origin correct. And I should just mention, this isn't the very, very end of the presentation, just a link, but I have a whole separate GitHub project for the book that I wrote, and there's a different example of a cat whose pupils don't go around, they go back and forth. So if that's something you're interested in doing, I would direct you to, basically, I'll just show you real quick. It's just my other GitHub page. It's called Learning CSS Animations. And it's chapter, what chapter is it? Well, it's better to go to this. And again, this is linked to at the end of the slides. Chapter 9. So this is an example of a different kind of pupil movement, if that's the kind of thing that you're interested in. Okay, just a few more things here. So I want to talk about this bouncing spring. So this one is more complicated. Let's just look at it one more time. So it's just a spring. It recoils long. It compresses. It recoils a little less long. And then it does that a few times. I'm only showing part of the code on the slides. Oops. But I just want to show you this visualization, because I think it helps illustrate what's going on. So basically, if we look at the first 2 keyframes, we start with a scale of 1, and then we decrease it to a scale of 1, 0.5. So there's 2 values here, because the first value is width. We're keeping the width the same. We're just shrinking the height. So what's happening here is we're basically compressing the height by 1/2, between 0 and 30%. And I tried to make these to scale. They're not perfect, but I'm trying to give a sense of how this works. And then from 30 to 40, we're going from that 1/2 to 1.5 times, which is the tallest it ever gets. And then we just sort of progressively keep doing the same thing, but shrinking down the recoil each time. And then we just get something that looks like that. So these are nice. They're not that hard to do. I did have to think about this. I did kind of have to draw it out. I find that I often have to do that when I'm doing keyframes, is it helps me if I just kind of put it down on paper and think about how much time I want to spend in each sort of A to B, B to C. That's really, in my mind, the trickiest bit, is getting the timing correct. Okay, so this is the main thing I want you to think about when you leave, which is, do I have some images on my website that I could add a little bit of animation to? Don't just background image, animate. And this could be something really, really simple, like this group Strike Debt, which is awesome, and you should look up if you've never heard of them. They basically buy debt in the secondary market that debt collectors would buy and like hound you and harass you and threaten you, and they buy it and they abolish it. No questions asked. And they buy medical debt, which it's no one's fault if they get sick, really. So anyway, I'm showing you their site just because of this. It's very simple, it's just a rotate, but I really like it, and it looks really nice. And this is such an easy thing to add to your site. And I know I'm a dork, and so obviously this makes me happy maybe more than a regular person, but I can't tell you how often I do this. So that's one thing you could do. This is a little more complicated. So maybe you have a site about getting on a boat, and maybe in the past you just had a picture of a boat and a picture of the ocean. Well, why not animate your ocean and animate your boat? Because you want to entice people to get on your boat. So I just want to show you basically how I did these 3 things, and then we'll be about done. So the boat is pretty simple. It's a rotation, a rotate Z. So I mentioned this before. You can start at 0%, or you can use the keyword from and then go to 100%, or use the keyword to. So I'm transforming on the Z-axis. I'm going -2 degrees and then 4 degrees. And because I set it to alternate, it goes back and forth. And then the timing function ease in and out. It's just a little slower on this end and a little slower on that end. And then it just bobs back and forth, and it's a rocking boat. And you can see it rocking here too. Who's used the HTML5 boilerplate? So I used the HTML5 boilerplate's responsive. So you know how you can customize it, and one of the choices is a responsive site. So I used that as my starting point for this boat site, and so there are already some predefined media queries. And the way that this template works is they want you to design for mobile first, right? That's like the new hotness right now, mobile first, desktop next. So by default, this is small. And then I set up in my media query for anything over 768 to be a bit larger. So this doesn't have anything to do with animations per se, but it makes it a little bit nicer when I shrink this down as if I were on a phone. You can see the boat gets smaller so that the boat wouldn't be quite so large on the phone. And I actually did the same thing. I don't have a slide about it, but I actually changed the transform origin. It's a little bit subtle, but the transform origin when it's on a desktop is here because it was on the right. So I kind of wanted to make it look like it was sort of off to the edge and kind of bobbing up like that. And then when it's on a smaller device, the transform origin is in the middle, and it's doing it a bit more evenly. It's not a hugely, it's a bit subtle, but that was just another thing that I played around with the media query on this example. So last part, I think, is these ocean waves. So these are 2 divs, both with background images. The first div basically has a background image set, and then I'm alternating the background position. So I'm just moving it back and forth by pushing the background position back and forth. And I do it over 2 seconds, and I alternate it, and I make sure that it sticks, although this is probably superfluous since it is infinite. But if this were not infinite, this animation fill mode forwards would be important. And now this one is a bit harder to see. Let me make it a bit bigger. This is a scale up. So this is the second div with the same background image. And this is what I wanted to mention before. If you are not changing the style of the element between the start of the animation and what it is right now, you don't actually even have to specify from. So what I mean by that is my scale right now is just scale 1. And that's what I want the from to be. I want from to be scale 1. So since it's already scale 1, I don't even need to specify from. The browser can figure that out. So you can save yourself some typing and a byte or 2. If you are not changing the way the animation begins from the way the element is right now, you don't even need the from or the 0%. You can just jump to the 100% or the 20% or whatever. So this is just scaling up. Width stays the same, height goes up. One thing I should mention, it's not on the slide, the transform origin is down here. By default, transform origin is in the middle. So if I kept it in the middle, the waves would have grown down as well as up, which is not what I wanted. I only wanted the waves to grow up. So I had to change the transform origin to be, I set it to be 50%. Where's my, so like if this is my wave, 50%, 100%. So it's down here, so it grows up like that. And then I just use positioning to put them basically on top of each other to get an effect kind of like that. So none of these are super complicated, I realize, but really just what I wanted to convey is that with a little bit of work, not too complicated of a keyframe, you can add some interesting, nice little effects to your site that really, in my mind, make a difference. They make them much more interesting than if these were static images. And so I strongly encourage you to do this and play around, and they're pretty fun. If you are interested in more complicated things like flash style or flash replacement, I go into some more complicated examples in my book. But again, you don't even need to buy the book, although I probably shouldn't say that. You can just look at the code on my GitHub page and poke around on that. So let me see, what else do I have here? So just some shout outs, I guess. I mentioned this. Not too many of you raised your hand. Totally check this out. The HTML5 boilerplate will save you so much time, especially this responsive one, because you don't want to mess around like writing your own media queries to start with. You want to leverage the web's brilliance and people like Divya and Paul. This is a presentation deck from Leah. Same with the Lightbox example. And then I just credited our little open clip art friends. So I realized I should have done this at the beginning of the talk, but I didn't. So these slides are up now. I will probably be tweaking them because I just always do that. But I'll just re-upload it to the same place. They are also up on GitHub. And like I mentioned, the code samples from my book are up, and the code samples from this talk are also up. So you can look at it in the presentation. You don't have to look at it on GitHub, but I just find it sometimes a little bit easier to download it, a zip file or pull it to my Git repository or whatever, and as opposed to kind of inspecting element and looking around. But both options are available. And I'm happy to take questions. I'm happy to take them at the mic or privately, whatever you people want. But I really appreciate you coming. It's, end of the day, it's a graveyard shift. So thank you.